Hello, good afternoon. At least I'm not at the end of the day. You guys all seem to be awake and attentive still. How many of you have had challenges figuring out how to build personas, which personas to build, utilizing those personas? I don't think you're a product marketer unless you've looked at personas and gone, what the heck am I doing here? My name's Jason. I'm Vice President of Product Marketing at a company called Delinea. I'm a little bit of a nomad. I've lived in several locations around the US. I was lucky enough to also live in Europe for a few years, leading marketing for an organization supporting all 126 countries across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I moved here to Austin in 2016. I actually originally went to college to be an aerospace engineer, for those of you that started off from a technical perspective. I decided I didn't want to solve physics problems the rest of my life, and I'd rather do comms problems, so I switched degrees, did my MBA. I've been a marketer my whole career, but I've been in tech for most of it. I actually started off in aviation in my professional career, and I've worked for both very small companies and very large companies. Through a series of acquisitions, I went to Quest Software. Quest got bought by Dell. For those of you who have worked for Dell, you know there's been a lot of acquisitions and divestitures. And then after Dell, I went to IBM, where I was there for 4.5 years supporting their data and AI business. And then today, I'm at a company called Delinea. We're in the cybersecurity space. We deal with privileged access management, which is all about what you can and cannot do when you're trying to access your company's resources. And through all of that, I've held product marketing roles, but I've also held a lot of other marketing roles, everything from demand gen, field, partner, events, email, all of those things. But I always come back home to product marketing. I've heard a lot of people mention this today, but we tend to be kind of the nexus of a lot of the functions. We bridge a lot of functions, not only across the business, but within marketing. And it's probably the favorite thing for me about being a product marketer. So before I start, I want to ask you guys a few questions. How many of you are familiar with Serious Decisions? Good. How many of you have or currently work with Forrester? How many of you know that Forrester and Serious Decisions became the same company a couple years ago? Okay, good. So I'm lucky enough to have been a customer of Serious Decisions and actually, consumed their materials back when they came out with the first demand gen waterfall a long time ago. And I continue to be a client of theirs as they merge with Forrester. So a lot of the information I'm going to share with you is based on the tools, the frameworks, the best practices I learned from Serious Decisions and Forrester. I know the Product Marketing Alliance also has tools and frameworks for you as well. So these are the examples from me and my experience, but I think you can translate them based on the resources that you have at your disposal as well. So the first thing I always start off with in any role and with all of my teams is everything we do has to align across product marketing, product management, and sales. And I think I've heard it in every session today. Alignment is key. How do you make sure you have alignment in what you're doing? Because if you don't have alignment, anything you produce is just not going to land, either internally or externally. So everything I'm going to share with you today is going to start with the fact that we had participation, input, and agreement across these functions as we moved forward. We couldn't do that without the agreement across the three functions. So I know this is about going beyond demographics. We actually have to take a step back and go, well, how do you decide what personas to build in the first place? And the first question to ask is, well, who are your buyers? And you have to agree on that internally. You can't build personas without understanding who you're talking to first. It's kind of, makes sense, common sense, but you don't want to go build a persona unless you have agreement first on who that is. And there's a lot of ways that you can start. You can look at your historical customer data. You can interview sales. You can do market analysis. You can compare to who your competitors target. But internally, you have to figure out what your priorities are. Maybe your product or service can be bought by anybody in the world, but you can't boil the ocean. There's got to be some level of segmentation that's going to be the biggest priority that you orient on first and drive success there before you can go in and target those other segments. And the first place you have to start is really to think about, are you solving for your whole portfolio? Are you solving for a specific set of products, or if you're in a large company, a specific business unit? Or if you have a very broad product, are you trying to solve for specific use cases within that product? In some cases, they could be the same buyers across all of those levels, but in other cases, they could be very different buyers depending on what you're marketing. Next, you have to think about the regions. Just like we heard in the Salesforce session, there's very big differences in a lot of cases depending on what region that you're selling and marketing into. So you really have to think about, well, are we really only focused on North America, or are we next trying to go to Europe or APAC or a very specific country with very specific needs, and do the buyers act differently depending on where they're located? And then who are your buying groups? Is it IT, finance, the C-suite? They, again, could interact very differently with you depending on what group they sit in within the company. And then what industries are you focused on? Here at Delinea Cybersecurity, everybody needs security, so we don't really focus on industries, but there are solutions where it could be very different depending on what vertical that you're marketing into, and maybe it depends if they're regulated or not regulated. So you really have to think about, again, what are the priorities, because you may not be able to go solve for every vertical market. And of course, size and revenue. Are you targeting small companies, big companies, in between? At Delinea, we skew towards the mid-market, sometimes up into the small enterprise, and we also have very large enterprise customers as well, but we can't solve for every one of those companies. So we skew more towards mid-market, small enterprise, and that helps us prioritize the needs that we're going after, because the buyer at a very large multinational is going to be very different than a company that's solely based in one country, and that buyer does not have to interact with multiple organizations, countries, et cetera, when they're purchasing. So then you think about what personas that you have to build, and the examples I'm going to give on this slide do come from the Forrester B2B buyer persona framework. You have to think about the buying groups and their behavior, and there's really three categories that falls into. The first is independent, and again, common sense would say, okay, that's a single buyer, but it could be a few buyers. But largely, this is a smaller purchase where it can be made by one or few people, and it's pretty easy to facilitate. This is not a very complex buying process. Then you go on to a consensus buying group, and that's a medium-sized purchase where a group or a team of people across one or a few departments are agreeing to the purchase. Makes sense. And then you go on to committee, and this is a complex purchase where this affects many different departments, where the decision is often phased, it's hierarchical, there's often an executive sponsor. And no surprise, this is where some of the largest and most complex buying processes exist. And as you can imagine, the way that they purchase is going to be very different. And the way you have to address the needs of the people in that buying group is going to vary based on those different types of buying groups. At Delinea, we largely skew towards consensus. So we're dealing with people in the buying group that are largely in the same department or have the same roles, although not always the case. Very difficult if you're dealing with very large, complex enterprise buying cycles in the committee because you have a lot of stakeholders that you're trying to address. So what if you had to build personas for every person in the buying group? All of a sudden, you're now multiplying the messaging that you have to build, and then exponentially building all of the content that those buyers need as they go through the buying journey, and you have to map out a buying journey for every single persona. Overwhelming? Anybody? There was definitely a time when this is the way that I thought, and it was definitely overwhelming for me. Honestly, every time that I ran into this problem, we really only built personas for the top one or two buyers and kind of ignored the rest, and it was good enough. We never had time to go back and build it out for every single persona. So that approach, it just did not work. And what I'm here to tell you is this is not the answer, so don't be too overwhelmed. The answer actually is, what if I told you you didn't need to do this for every single person in the buying group, but really you can address most of the needs and the characteristics of your buying group in one persona? Now, you're still going to give it certain characteristics, like you're going to give it a certain role or give that persona a combination of characteristics, but identify them as a type of person. But you're really addressing the needs of multiple buyers in that buying group. And there may be unique needs for certain people in that buying group, but you can likely address those. And those could be specific functions like legal or finance or procurement or people in the line of business. And if significantly unique, maybe you do need to create separate personas for them, but likely not the case. So about 80% of what you can do when building the persona can be grouped together in one messaging document and through the same set of content. You don't have to go build multiple messaging documents, multiple routes to your content, multiple buying journeys. And for those 20% of the likely unique needs, you address those through specific components of your messaging document, and you may have a few unique pieces of content that address their specific needs in the buying process, but it's additive. You're not multiplying or exponentially increasing the messaging and the content that you have to build. That took a big weight off of my shoulders when I realized that, because then I wasn't stressing about how are we ever going to have the time to go back and build all those personas. We can't do that. We need to build content and drive demand and do product launches. I'm sure all of you have felt that. And really, if you think about the commonality of the buyers and what it is they need from you as a vendor when they're making those purchase decisions, you're going to find that so much of it is common. So I've talked so far about even just getting to the point of figuring out what personas to build. Now we'll really get to the heart of the topic. And when a lot of people think about personas, they think about the demographics of those personas, the things that you can quantify, that you can target on. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fantastic. You think about things like their title, their age, their gender, their location, their income, their education, their tenure, and that's fine. You can target your marketing programs based on them. You can figure out who they are and what characteristics they share, but I'd like to say that that's not enough. That's not going to really help you understand why and how and when and where. It may give you the who, but I really think that that is as far as it goes. So you have to take it a little bit further. So how can you understand these buyers? What are the things that you need to be asking yourselves and finding out to go beyond those demographics? So answer several questions. What are their needs? Why are they looking for a solution? And what are the things that they need that solution to do to solve the problems or to address the challenges? And what are those challenges that are preventing them from getting to the outcomes that they're trying to drive or that their business is trying to accomplish? What motivates them? We've heard this in a couple of sessions. Some of it is emotional, right? Personal pride, confidence, the ability to get the job done. But there may be things more practical, like they've got to cut their budget, they're reducing resources, they have a growth target on them, they have to drive transformation. Big thing in our area, digital transformation, moving to the cloud. So there's motivations that you have to tie to and address when you're defining these personas. And then, even more importantly, is how do they want to interact? I'm sure all of us have seen the research where more and more, especially in B2B, buyers want to do their research on their own. And they do something like 60 to 70% of the work before they engage a vendor. So you have to understand what part of the buying journey do they want to interact with you or not? Where do they want to interact? What kind of content do they want to interact with? And that information is really going to help drive a lot of downstream activity. What are the requirements when buying? And I mentioned this a little bit ago. It greatly depends whether it's a committee, a consensus, or an independent buy, but they may have other requirements. They may have regulatory requirements. Procurement may have to come in and negotiate terms. There may be different things that they have to address when buying your solution, so make sure you're aware of what those are so that you can build that in as part of your persona profile. And then how do they buy? Again, as a committee, they have to bring a lot of people together. There's an executive sponsor. There's a lot of investment on the line versus somebody whipping out their credit card and being able to transact online. Those are two very different types of buying. And again, when you build your persona, that's critical information to know. And I'll share later where that can be used and why it's important. So let's go beyond demographics. But what are some of the things that we should learn to answer those questions? So again, this comes from the Forrester B2B buyer persona framework, but the first category of characteristics beyond demographics are functional attributes. And this still aligns with demographics a little bit. So what is their job role? But not just the common titles, but what is their responsibility within the organization, within the buying group? What buying center are they in? Are they in a specific department? Are they part of a special project group? Or are they in the C-suite or driving strategic initiatives? And then what are the firmographics? So some of the things that I showed you earlier, size, industry, location, etc. Next, you want to look at emotive attributes, because as we heard earlier, you can connect on a logical level, but you're really going to nail it when you start to bring in the emotional connection. So think about the initiatives they're trying to drive. Digital transformation being one that we focus on a lot, but there are a lot of other things. It could be sustainability, as an example. And then again, what are the challenges that they face in trying to get those initiatives off the ground and be successful? What are the business drivers? Is it growth? Is it retention? Is it market share? You have to figure out what's going to be that driver that they're going to align with. And we also heard this mentioned earlier, but what vocabulary are they going to use? And does that change based on where they are? If you're not using their language when they're going to look for solutions or when they're trying to solve their problems, either you're not going to show up at all because they put in the Google search and you weren't there because you're on the wrong keywords, or when your marketing is out there or your sellers are talking to them, they're not resonating with what you're saying because you're not using the same language. Next, you want to look at behavioral attributes. So I mentioned this already, but what kind of content do they want to interact with and when? Do they like videos? Do they want to be at events? Do they want things that are very educational or things that are more instructional? Do they want to be at industry events, virtual events? Do they want to consume things online? Do they want you to be proactive, or would they rather reach out to get the content that you have? And what are their trusted sources? Are they going to industry analysts? Are they going to peer review sites? Are they just going out on the socials and seeing what their peers are recommending or not recommending? And then last but not least, what is that decision-making process? What is their role within the buying group? Usually we prioritize and focus on the economic buyer, but depending on what you're marketing and selling, the influencer could be just as important, or the user. So you have to think about the role that they play in that buying process when you're building that profile, and then what is their engagement level? Some personas are highly engaged all throughout the buying journey. Some could only come in at the end or only at the beginning, and you have to think about how that affects the persona that you're building and therefore all the things you're doing with that persona. And then what drives the vendor selection, both from a positive and a negative perspective? What things are they looking for from vendors, and what are some of the red flags that make them down-select vendors as well? And then think about your own market category, and what is the perception of that category? Is it new and emerging, and you have to even educate them about why they need to consider this type of solution in the first place and change the status quo of what they're doing today? Or is it a very well-established market, and it's on every shopping list of every company, so you don't have to justify why they need the solution, just why they need your solution? Is it highly competitive, and therefore you're going head-to-head against the same vendors in every deal, and you have to make sure that when you're building off of the content off this persona, that you're addressing that in your messaging and your content? That's all important, because what sits in this persona profile then gets used in everything else that we do in product marketing. I actually consider a persona as almost completely foundational to everything else. You should not be building messaging, you should not be building content, you should not be doing anything unless you're aligned on your personas and you have all of this type of information available to pull from. Now, fun question. Who thinks data is more important than opinions? Okay. Who thinks opinions are more important than data? Mixed group. You guys are a little shy right now. So in my opinion, I prefer data, because then it's not just about what I or someone else thinks. It actually brings in an outside perspective of what's going on in the real world. What I always worry about, especially at some of the larger companies I've worked for, we tend to drink our own Kool-Aid and we create our own reality and we start to create our own ideal buyer. Oh my God, what if we had these people that just perfectly knew exactly what we wanted to sell them and they bought it? But that doesn't work that way. And often when you use opinions, the loudest voice in the room ends up winning out, and they aren't always right. So I prefer using data, which is no surprise, But again, there's both quantitative and qualitative data, and there's a lot of ways to get that data. And I'll give you some examples of data sources that I've used and ways that I've gotten it to reinforce and to enrich the persona profiles that we build. So the first, which we've heard about already, are things like customer surveys, could be prospect surveys. There's really easy ways to do this internally. SurveyMonkey was used as an example earlier. Very low cost. You could do that really easily to your own internal customer database and get aggregated data back. There's also external vendors that are really good at this. I've had the luck of using a company called GLG Insights. They have a huge network of technical professionals, and you can tell them, I'm trying to target people with these titles. They could either be my customers or not customers, and again, they'll field surveys out to them and even do interviews and focus groups to get that external data that we can bring back in. Customer interviews. I know these are hard to get. I know sales can be very protective of their customers. Don't mess up my deal. Don't mess up my customer. And they're time consuming. One way that you can ensure that you're doing this is to KPI or OKR your PMMs to do 1 or 2 a quarter, just to make sure it's part of the cadence of the PMM work every quarter. Third-party research is huge, because we don't always have the resources to go out and get all of this data ourselves. In our instance, I've used it here at Delinea. I've also used it in past roles. There's Forrester fields a survey. It's called the Forrester B2B Buyer Journey Survey. This last year, it was fielded out to like 22,000 professionals globally. When you get the data, you can focus again on certain roles or functions. So we got it for the IT leaders and the security leaders. And all of the things that I talked about today, how they buy, how involved they are, how they like to interact, the type of content they use, all of that is in there as data that Forrester gathers as part of the survey. And there's other sources like that that you can use that are definitely not as expensive either, but a great source of bringing in a lot of that unmeasurable data that you can't get just by looking at demographics. Use your own marketing data. Look at your website traffic. Look at the SEO terms and the traffic that those terms are getting through searches. Look at the engagement with your content. Are there certain topics that tend to get more organic downloads or registrations than others? Those can start to guide you as well in terms of the preferences of the buying group and the buyers that you're trying to target. Sales interviews. I know it can be hard to get sellers' time. They have to be out there closing deals. However, it's really important to talk to them because they're out there talking to your customers and your prospects every single day. And even if you're not going to them for source information, you can use them to augment and validate the data that you're pulling together and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing from some of this data and these surveys we're doing, and is this the way the customers are talking to you, and are these the problems that they're surfacing? It's a really great way to do that, and you don't have to go to your whole field, but definitely, and I'm going to use this idea that came up earlier, something like a sales advisory board or your key sellers, I think is a great way to get that feedback and input. And then last but not least, audience data. So we use a tool called SparkToro. It's very inexpensive, and what you can do is you can type in certain search terms or keywords, and it will look at all of the people out there with social profiles that use those terms in their postings, and then we'll look at where do they engage. What are the top social media sites that they engage with, the top accounts, what podcasts do they listen to, what publications do they engage with, who are some of the top influencers, social influencers that they engage with as well. And that adds more color and gives information to some of the other marketers on areas that they could go. Maybe there's an influencer that's not on the list that you want to start working with, or a publication that's talking about topics in your market that you may not be aware of. So that helps add more color to the other data that you're pulling together. So the last thing I'd like to leave you with is, how do you utilize these personas? Is this really something that you just create for product marketing? It just sits within product marketing. You put it on a shelf, you dust it off every time you need to build some messaging or something? No. My recommendation is that this is a living, breathing document. You should update your personas as and when you get new insights and new data. And you should use them in multiple ways. So internally, we published our personas on our wiki. It's actually available to every employee at Delinea. Now, obviously, not everyone is going to go there and read it and utilize it, but it's there. And it helps drive alignment. We never had consistent published buyer personas before this, ever. Not on the product side, not on the sales side, not on the marketing side. So make sure that it's available to everyone, and then embed it. I said it already, but to me, personas are the foundation of everything else. So take that persona data that you've put together and use that when you're building your buyer's journey. Use that when you're building your messaging. Use that when you're building your content. All of those things should be aligned and based on who your buyers are. And then cross-pollinate it across the company. This is not just useful for product marketing or even just marketing. We have an initiative going on right now internally about building a better customer journey. And part of what we're doing is using the persona data to figure out what's the best value we can give our prospects and customers up until the purchase process, because that's the data that I've built in our personas. And then we'll start to build the post-purchase customer value chain. My team actually designed and built almost all of our sales kickoff content this year. Where do you think we got all of the insights about our buyers when we were building those sales tools and those playbooks that we delivered to the sellers this year? That all started based on the profile work that we did earlier in the year, so we could confidently go to these sellers and say, here are the needs that we've identified, here are the buyers we've identified, the outcomes they're trying to drive, the initiatives that they're trying to align to, and that made building those sales tools and those playbooks so much easier. And then product planning. We've talked about this today several times. Yes, your product teams care about users because that's who's engaging with the product, but when they're looking forward about what problems do our products need to solve, having that alignment on your buyers and those characteristics are going to help inform your product teams over what's the next cool new feature, what's the next new product, what's the next M&A we should go for that we should bring in that will help solve additional problems that our buyers have. So there's a lot of uses for these personas that goes beyond just what the product marketing team needs them for, but in my mind, these personas are crucial and critical for what we do every day. And that is what I'd like to share with you, so I'm not sure if there's any questions.
It's a delay. It's okay. I'm still learning. Okay, so hot topic, the name of the tool, which was SparkToro. You write that down, SparkToro, audience research, and the favorite word we heard that he said was inexpensive.
Yes,
so we like
SparkToro, SparkToro.
Okay, and I feel like you covered it a little bit in the last slide, but this one got a few upvotes. So how do you recommend working with product on leveraging who they are building the product for versus who you're actually focusing on selling it to? Where's that favorite marketing word, synergy?
Yes. So obviously they have to pay attention to the user because that's who's engaging with the product on a day-to-day basis, but that's not necessarily who's buying the product. So you just have to come into alignment on who owns defining which of those personas, and for us, it's our design and UX team that owns the user personas. My team owns the buyer personas. And where we align on, the buyers are going to drive the revenue. The users are going to drive the satisfaction, the stickiness, and the happiness with what our products are so that we can drive future revenue. But we've got to continue to drive new business, and that's where we're going to utilize those buyer personas. And then in the future, what additional products and features do we need to build?